South Africa's crime crisis has been a crisis for decades and decades. But in the last few months to years, it has got way more scrutiny than it usually does. We have seen so much debate about the crime going on in South Africa around white genocide and farm murders and targeted killings of white people, yada, 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 yada. You know the story. You've seen our shows on this already. We have seen added renewed focus on crime statistics because of the consistent acts of gender-based violence and femicide going on in South Africa. We've covered that too in the last handful of days. And we have seen consistent closer looks at how to police and fight back against crime, particularly in the last year, because in KwaZulu-Natal, General Mkhwanazi has led an extremely heavy-handed policing approach against suspects in potential arrest situations. And we have seen many more shootouts between police and suspects than we usually do, and many more suspects being killed in those moments of confrontation. We saw it again last week with a suspect who was found in Amanzimtoti who was suspected of being involved in the murder of Olorato Mongale. So let's talk about the latest crime statistics that were announced just a few days ago, covering the first quarter in South Africa from the 1st of January to the 31st of March, 2025, because they are incredibly interesting. And there is actually one very significant piece of good news. Right, let's get into it. So last night on the TV show, the Dan Corder Show on the NCA, we interviewed Gareth Newham from the Institute of Security Studies. He pointed out some really interesting things. The first one is that out of all crime statistics, murder rates are the most reliable indicator in every country in the world of whether or not crime is broadly increasing or decreasing. And he said it's because with murder, the nature of murder is that there are a couple of things. Firstly, there are virtually always bodies or at least remains, which means you can reliably go, this person has been killed. Whereas with other crimes, it is often harder to prove what happened. You have to go through a rigorous court process before finding convictions. And the other point that he made is that murder specifically is an extremely well documented and covered kind of crime. And so often there are many bodies, from police to government to Justice Department to independent research think tanks and the rest, investigating murder, journalists and the rest. And so you can compare all of that data together to actually find out the murder rates. And so murder is the most reliable indicator of whether or not crime is getting better or worse in a country. And then he said something that truly fascinated me. The significance of the crime stats we just got is that it is showing for the first time in longer than a decade that murder rates are decreasing in South Africa. They have gone down, and they are slowly but surely cresting a wave and going down, at least based on the latest statistics that we have. And that is fascinating, considering how much emphasis the media has placed on murders, farm murders, femicide, and the rest in the last handful of months to years, and it makes sense why that has happened. But it was his deeper explanation of the history of murder rates in South Africa, which is so fascinating. So the first thing that he said was that murder rates steadily went down from 1994 at the start of the new South Africa to about 2012, and actually pretty much halved per year by 2012. And the theories about that was, obviously, that there wasn't violent fighting between the apartheid state, the apartheid police being heavy-handed in the way that they treated people of color, fighting in between third forces, the IFP, the ANC, all of the tumult of the struggle, all of that stopped. And more people, frankly, just started to believe that they could have a decent quality of life in South Africa when the police weren't an instrument of state oppression. And so slowly but surely, murder rates dropped all the way through until 2012.
I do want to say at this point that I think that some people will probably argue that, I don't know, because the ANC took over, that police reporting was just worse and that's why the number halved. But he actually said the opposite is true, right? We had people reporting crimes to policemen that now would converse with them in their own language. So actually reporting was going up at the time as well. And I think that's an important point to make.
Totally. The police became trusted because they were no longer the apartheid police. And so people were just far more likely to go and report all kinds of crimes, as Eric said, speaking to people in their own languages, being welcoming, being interested in their cases. People were no longer afraid of the police as an instrument of apartheid oppression. Because, during apartheid, the best way to handle the police as a person of color was to make sure they didn't know that you existed. And so crime reporting got a lot better after 1994 and was far more likely to reflect what was really going on. So the crime rates went down, halved between per year average, but from 1994 to 2012. And then Gareth Newham was talking about how from 2012 until basically present day, they have been going up over the last longer than a decade. And the obvious reasons why you could think that that is the case is a lot. State capture, the disempowering of the police and the Justice Department, the undermining of the state, with a pervading belief in South Africa that crime and corruption at high level was getting so bad, and the Rainbow Nation fantasy was wearing off. People were now, by 2012, nearly 20 years into the new South Africa, many South Africans had not seen demonstrable change, had not seen demonstrable new opportunities for them to create better qualities of life. And when you lose hope that things are going to get better, crime out of necessity or willingness to commit crime suddenly seems far more likely to happen. And so Gareth Newham was talking about, remember, the most reliable kinds of crime statistics are murder rates increasing over the last longer than a decade from 2012. But now it's just started to tip over. And so then the question becomes, why? Has policing improved? Has a mood happened in South Africa that has caused change? Is it General like Mkhwanazi terrifying people? And that's where he was more like considered. And he said, well, it's really hard to figure out what exactly is happening. It could be the fact that people now generally believe that the police are more likely to catch you. It could be the fact that we reached a peak moment where everyone who would be willing to commit a murder is now committing murders. Because he spoke really interestingly about how in a massive country, there are only a small number of people who are willing to commit crime and able to, and an even smaller number of people who are willing to commit violent crime and potentially kill someone. And it could actually just be that we in South Africa have got to the point now where everyone who would be willing to commit a murder is kind of committing murders. So we may have just got to a peak saturation point. And so this may not be good news. This may just be us finding out how many people in South Africa are actually willing to kill other people. But it may also be that policing has got better. It may also be that South Africans are now starting to believe that there is more hope in the country again, that South Africans are starting to believe that like they are not completely on their own. So all of that's very interesting. And then you add the fact that all other kinds of violent crime have gone down in the last quarter, which is very cool, except rape and sexual assault. Go back to our episode about Olorato Mongale from last week, and you will hear more about that. And then the only other kind of crime that has increased is fraud, white-collar crime, that kind of stuff. So that's all the data that we have, the new data. But then there's so much more to think about to understand what to do with all of this information. So something that I also learned last night, which is so fascinating, is that the reason why murder rates are so important to rely on is that basically all kinds of crimes are not necessarily a reflection of how well the police are doing. It's a reflection of what is being reported and how much of it is being reported. So as we spoke about in the 90s, if people have more faith that the police are going to do something about crime, they're just more likely to report crimes, which may then make it look like crime is getting worse. No, actually, it's just more of the crime that is happening anyway is being reported on. That's super important to remember. So maybe it's very possible that all kinds of crimes, like violent crimes except sexual assault, are just being reported on less, but are still happening at a very high rate because maybe there's a lack of faith in the police service. That's something that has to be figured out and teased out with more research and more data inquiry. He also spoke about how it's very, very rare for white-collar crime to be reported at all because big companies don't want anybody to find out that the bank had a fraud internal crisis, or a security company doesn't want people to find out that their security guards are being bought off or are, cooking the books.
Yeah, I mean, he mentioned a number there. He said it was almost like only 15% reporting for fraud and white-collar crime like that. But I think also a big indictment on gender-based violence and rape and sexual assault and that is the fact that I would assume that the faith in the police there is probably at its lowest.
Yeah.
And so the underreporting there will probably be massive.
And yet it's still gone up.
And yet it's still gone up.
Totally.
And that is something we definitely need to reflect on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we need to ask again why the government hasn't declared a state of disaster over the gender-based violence pandemic when any other thing happening at this scale, you would expect there to be a national state of disaster called. Again, we spoke to Women for Change last night on the TV show. They were phenomenal in making that point that they have been calling on. So a bunch of other things super interesting that we learned from Gareth Newham. Okay, there are only so many people who are willing to commit murder. And he spoke a lot about different policing strategies. So his point is that in South Africa, there's been a lot of kind of shock and awe public performance policing in the last handful of years. We're going to do roadblocks and we're going to make sure that there are men and women in uniform on every street corner and all over the place. Whereas actually, he was pointing out that if we just take murders, that in something like less than a dozen police precincts in the country is where 50% of the murders happen, or like areas of the country. And if you just focused on those key areas, really, really, really bringing security and police presence, you could slash the murder rate in the country. Similarly, there are different areas in the country where there's just like one police station or one police precinct, which need more of them. They just need more hands on deck to stop all of the kinds of crimes happening there. So that's super interesting in terms of police strategy. The other interesting thing that he pointed out is that a lot of murders happen because of robberies gone wrong. So if you get a handle on robberies, you actually stop a lot of murders, because murders happen from robberies when people get confronted, robbers get confronted, and then they use the guns that they have to kill the people they are robbing, when in another circumstance, they would not have used those guns. They didn't go in with the intention of killing the person they were robbing. They just went in to rob and try and get some kind of bounty, some loot from it. So I found that really fascinating. But now let's talk about heavy-handed policing. So General Mkhwanazi has become, I'm not going to say quite a household name, but I think the vast majority of South Africans know about that guy from KZN who is finally being tough on the criminals, and the police are going in chasing the suspects with weapons. And that is good, because that's the only way we're going to stop the criminals. We need to fire on them. We need to make them understand there are consequences. We need to make them scared for their lives. Before they think about whether or not to commit a crime, we need them to be thinking, am I going to come out of this alive? Because the police, if we're in KZN, are so terrifying and they really, really may kill me. That is a very, very common argument or notion. It's also used about the death penalty a lot. It's like people will commit fewer serious crimes if they are scared that they could face the death penalty for committing those crimes. And all the data, by the way, on death penalty and heavy-handed policing shows that levels of crime do not drop because of the potential for violence. With the death penalty and with heavy-handed policing, all of the data around the world shows that introduction of the death penalty or taking it away, introduction of heavy-hand policing or taking it away, does not affect the rate of crimes committed. And that goes to a psychological understanding of the risk calculus that people make when they're about to commit a crime. The calculus is not what is the worst possible outcome for me here. The calculus is more, how likely is it that I will be caught at all? You don't worry about a consequence if it's very unlikely that it's going to happen to you, right? You worry about how likely it is that something will go wrong. And so what's far more important in affecting the risk calculus when someone is deciding whether or not to commit a crime is to affect how likely they think it is that they will be caught at all. After they get caught is a separate thing that doesn't affect whether or not they commit a crime in the first place or choose to. But changing the way up of whether or not they think they're going to be caught is what really causes change, not heavy-handed policing or the death penalty. And so Gareth Newham last night on the show was talking a lot about how with General Mkhwanazi leading heavy-handed tactics in KwaZulu-Natal, sure, it's very popular because in South Africa, we are full of being terrified of criminals. We are full of being terrified of crime. And we want criminals to be afraid and maybe to face some kinds of consequences, maybe not necessarily death, but consequences that we South Africans feel criminals very rarely face. But as I just described, it doesn't change the amount of crimes people are trying to commit. So what are the unintended consequences of these face-offs? One, worst case scenario, you kill a suspect who was not guilty of the crime. And we saw the potential danger of this last week with Olerato Mongale, because there was another suspect whose face was plastered all over the internet, all over the media, all over social media, by the police and by the government, wanted for questioning about Olerato's murder. And then they caught him, didn't kill him, they caught him. And a day or two later, they announced, okay, we questioned him, he's innocent. Now imagine if they had gone in heavy-handed there and he had thought, well, I am innocent, but these police are coming in with guns. What if he had been killed when it wasn't him? What if it makes us question the other suspect who was shot dead in Amanzimtoti? What if that suspect was not the person? What if heavy-handed tactics are causing the police to kill innocent people? That is dangerous and scary and frankly unethical and immoral. And that's why we have a justice system. It's why we arrest people and assume innocence until proven guilty. It's why we put them through the courts. It's why we find out beyond reasonable doubt whether or not they are guilty and don't just go around shooting suspects. So that's the one terrifying thing. But the second thing that Gareth Newman pointed out is that if you have heavy-handed policing and a perception of heavy-handed policing, then suspects being chased by the police are more fearful of being shot at if they are caught, which means that they are more likely to fire back and be violent quicker than if they thought that they would be arrested peacefully and face their day in court. If you think the police are going to fire on you and the police suddenly rock up at your house, you are more likely to reach for your weapon and shoot quickly or more quickly than if you thought the police were just going to arrest you and follow the human rights and the letter of the law. Which means more violent shootouts between police and would-be suspects, which means a higher likelihood of suspects who are innocent being killed in the line of or like in the crossfire before they face their day in court. And it also means it's more likely that we have police casualties, because if criminals are more likely to turn to their or suspects are more likely to turn to their weapons and fire on the police the second they see the police, it puts the police in far more danger than if they didn't.
I think that it can also be extrapolated a little bit further into the fact that it also means that the murder rate might go up as well, in the sense that, you know, if you're a criminal and you're worried about the police coming because you know they're going to be heavy-handed, you want to get out of there quicker, right? Which means that maybe more innocent people that are caught in a robbery or anything like that are probably more likely to be dealt with far faster from the criminal's point of view. So like it's pretty hectic.
Totally. So that's all the stuff that I think we need to be thinking about with General Mkhwanazi and heavy-handed police work as it is happening in KwaZulu-Natal. And I know that this is a massive debate. And so I want it to happen on the WhatsApp line, 0607613436. But the reason why I'm so glad that we've done this show is because this is so important. Crime is one of the great crises affecting everybody in South Africa. It's the reason why some people leave. It is literally the reason why some people leave. And we need to fundamentally understand, firstly, what is really happening in South Africa. And the way we do that is through properly understanding the crime statistics when they come out. And we need to seriously think about what kind of policing strategies we want to actually help us and to make our lives safer as the police and the government tries to fight against crime. Super important.